At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law smirked. Finally, it's ours. The lawyer opened the real will. She got nothing. I got the $9.80 million and the last word. The church smelled faintly of lies and damp wood, the kind of scent that clings to black clothes and lingers in your hair long after you leave. The pews were almost full. Neighbors, old colleagues of Richard's from the company, and family members who had not bothered to visit in years. The air felt thick, not only with grief, but with the unspoken tension of people waiting to see what would happen when a family that had been cracking for years was finally forced into one room. I sat in the front pew, my hands folded over the lace handkerchief I had embroidered decades ago, my wedding ring glinting faintly under the dull light filtering through stained glass. Richard's casket lay just a few feet away, polished oak, his photo propped on an easel beside it, a younger man smiling as though life had never known cruelty. The murmurs in the church softened as the pastor stepped forward to say a prayer. Chairs creaked, coats rustled, people bowed their heads. It was supposed to be a moment of solemnity, but before the words of comfort could even begin, I felt the weight of someone's gaze on me. Laura, my daughter-in-law, sat 2 seats down in a fitted black dress that looked more like something you'd wear to a cocktail party than to a funeral. Her lipstick was perfect. Not a smudge from tears because there had been no tears. She leaned toward me, her perfume sharp and cold, her voice just loud enough to slice through the hush. "Don't bother crying too much, Catherine. He's gone, and so is your free ride. This family's mine now." The words did not falter. They did not tremble. They landed like a slap in a room where everyone was supposed to be looking forward, but I felt a dozen pairs of eyes flick toward us. I stared at her, not blinking. Before I could answer, a couple from Richard's old golf club approached to offer their condolences. Laura straightened, plastered on a smile, and said to them in a tone dripping with ownership, "Finally, it's ours." She didn't even glance at me. The couple hesitated, their expressions tightening before they looked back at me, confusion in their eyes. They gave my hand a squeeze that was more pity than comfort, and moved on. The pastor's voice stumbled for a second before he found his place again. "A coffin can silence a room, but spite is louder." I could feel the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then came the whisper I will never forget. My granddaughter, barely 10, leaning close, mimicking the cruelty she had absorbed without even knowing its full weight. "Grandma, you're not even really family now." There was no malice in her small voice, just the blind repetition of something she had heard her mother say, perhaps more than once. I turned to look at her, and in that moment, I saw the future they imagined. Me fading from their lives, my presence erased as easily as my name from a mailbox. I pressed my lips into a thin line, holding my hand steady on my lap so she wouldn't see it tremble. Around us, a few relatives were whispering. Some avoided looking at me entirely. Others let their eyes linger with that soft, pitying expression people wear when they want you to know they think you're broken. My sister-in-law, sitting across the aisle, stared straight ahead, as if pretending not to hear would absolve her of having to react. I looked at the casket again. Richard and I had built everything together. Our home, the company, a life carved from nothing. But Laura and John had long decided the story should be told differently, that Richard was the sole architect, and I was just the wife who stayed in the background. Over the years, that lie had been told so often, it became their truth. I inhaled slowly. The lies seemed stronger now, the sweetness turning almost metallic in the back of my throat. I tightened my grip on the handkerchief, feeling the small embroidered initials R and K under my fingers. The pastor invited people to come forward to share memories. Laura didn't move, but I could see her smirk from the corner of my eye, as if daring me to speak and embarrass myself. I stayed seated. I knew better than to give her that satisfaction here. As people spoke about Richard's business deals, his charity work, his golf swing, I kept my face composed. No one mentioned the nights I stayed up balancing ledgers when the company nearly went under. No one spoke about the day I pawned my engagement ring to cover payroll. That was fine. Some truths are not for public eulogies. A hand touched my shoulder. It was Father Matthew murmuring something about strength. I nodded. I could feel Laura's gaze still on me, waiting for me to cry, to shake, to make her victory complete. I didn't. Instead, I let a small, cold smile curve my lips. They think this is the day I lose everything. They thought this was my ending. It was only my beginning. I was 24 when I first stepped into a classroom as Miss Catherine Doyle, literature teacher at a small high school on the edge of town. I believed in the power of words. in the way a story could bend someone's life toward the light. My desk was always stacked with essays, my evenings filled with lesson plans and stacks of books. I had plans for a master's degree, maybe even a doctorate. But then Richard walked into my life, a man with big ideas and an even bigger smile, selling office supplies from the trunk of his car, talking about how one day he'd build a company that would outgrow this small Ohio town. I married him a year later, not because I thought he'd be rich, but because I believed in his fire. When he asked me to leave teaching to help him with his fledgling business, I didn't hesitate. I became his secretary, his bookkeeper, his proofreader, his legal assistant, whatever the moment demanded. I drafted contracts on a typewriter we bought secondhand. I stayed up late balancing ledgers while Richard slept, trusting me to catch every missing cent. I learned to negotiate over the phone, to file legal documents, to push for better terms and supplier contracts. The first few years, our office was a converted storage room with one desk and 2 chairs. The coffee pot was as old as the building, and the heater clanged like an old freight train. When the company finally broke even, Richard credited me in every meeting. "We built this together," he'd say, squeezing my hand. His family respected me then. Holidays at the Doyle house were warm, full of laughter, and my place at the table felt secure. But success is a strange thing. It can make people forget how the foundation was laid. When John married Laura, she was charming, polished, and ambitious. She came from a family that measured worth in net worth. At first, we got along. I even offered her a role in the company, thinking she might bring in fresh ideas. But it wasn't long before I noticed her subtle rewrites of history. She'd introduce Richard as the self-made man who started from nothing without so much as a nod in my direction. At first, I let it slide. Then I overheard her telling a friend, Catherine, she was just a wife who stayed home and played hostess. Richard did the real work. It hurt, but not as much as hearing my own son repeat it one evening over dinner. "Dad built everything," John said casually, slicing into his steak. "You just hosted dinners." I set my fork down, my appetite gone. The real fracture came from a lie so poisonous it took root quickly. Laura began whispering to Richard's relatives that years ago when my mother-in-law was hospitalized, I had conveniently delayed paying the medical bills to pressure the family into selling a valuable piece of land. The truth? I had pawned my grandmother's sapphire necklace to cover those bills when the insurance stalled. I had the receipts, but by the time I realized the rumor had spread, no one wanted to hear the truth. From then on, my place in the Doyle family was no longer secure. The warmth of their greetings cooled. Invitations grew fewer. In subtle ways, Laura made sure I was kept on the periphery, still present for appearances, but never central. The hypocrisy was almost laughable. When Laura decided to quit her marketing job to take care of family after my granddaughter was born, everyone praised her. "She's making such a sacrifice," they said, as if giving up a paycheck was a mark of sainthood. When I had done the same, leaving behind a career I loved to build a company from scratch, I was called a dependent and lucky to have married well. I learned to stop correcting them. I stopped bringing up my years of work, the contracts I drafted, the all-nighters I pulled when we were still one late invoice away from collapse. Laura had rewritten the story, and John had chosen to believe her. But there are some truths you don't need to defend. Some truths wait quietly, knowing that when the right moment comes, they will speak for themselves. And as I sat at Richard's funeral, listening to Laura claim ownership over a legacy she never built, I knew that moment was coming sooner than she thought. When Richard's health began to decline, I moved into John and Laura's house without hesitation. It wasn't because they begged me. No, they made it sound like an arrangement of convenience. "You'll have your own room, Mom," John had said. "You can help out, keep things running while we focus on work." What he meant was that I would become the unpaid, unthanked staff. From the very first month, my role crystallized. Breakfast, I made it. Laundry, mine to fold. Groceries, I carried them in and put them away. I scrubbed bathrooms, vacuumed floors, and kept track of the grandchild's school forms. If something spilled, I was the one on my knees with a rag. It didn't matter if my back ached or my hands stiffened in the cold. I was available, and that meant I was responsible. Meals were always the same pattern. I cooked, they ate, and I ate last, standing at the counter picking at whatever was left. At first I thought it was just habit. But over time I noticed Laura never once said, "Sit with us, Catherine." She preferred I remain in the background, invisible, useful, but unseen. And the clothes. God forbid I wear anything nicer than my old cardigans or worn skirts. One evening before a small dinner party, Laura passed me in the hallway and said, Could you maybe change into something a little more muted? That sweater is a bit bright. Muted as in blend in, as in disappear. The breaking point in those years didn't come from the endless chores or the backhanded comments. It came on a Saturday evening during one of Laura's business networking parties. She had invited a dozen friends and colleagues, the kind of people who spoke in clip sentences about equity shares and branding strategies while sipping wine too expensive for my taste. I had been in the kitchen all day preparing appetizers. Laura insisted on 3 types of bruschetta, handmade spinach puffs, and a cheese board arranged like something out of a magazine. My hands smelled faintly of garlic and lemon oil. At some point in the evening, I stepped into the living room to quietly collect empty glasses. A tall man I'd never met before, wearing a navy suit and polished shoes, turned to me with a polite but distant smile. "Oh," he said, as if realizing something. "Are you the housekeeper?" For a fraction of a second, the room went silent in my ears. It was as if the words had been drawn in ink and hung in the air between us. I glanced toward Laura, expecting her to laugh and correct him. She didn't. She tilted her head, smiling in that restrained way she used when she was both amused and superior. "She just likes wearing thrift store stuff," she said lightly, then turned back to her conversation about investment portfolios. It was the casualness that cut the deepest, not even a flicker of embarrassment or a second thought. The man nodded, murmured something about, "Nice to meet you," and wandered off. I stood there holding 2 empty champagne flutes, my smile frozen in place. Inside, something shifted. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was the quiet, steady tightening of a rope I'd been holding for years, realizing I could choose when and how to pull it. I didn't correct him either. Not because it was true, but because in that moment I understood there was power in letting people underestimate you. If they saw only a harmless aging woman in a secondhand cardigan, they'd never see the day coming when I'd take everything back. Later that night, after the last guest left and Laura retreated upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen rinsing glasses. John walked in scrolling through his phone. "Laura says, 'You didn't need to mingle tonight. She thinks you might make people uncomfortable with, old stories and stuff.'" I didn't respond. I simply placed the glass on the drying rack and looked at him. He glanced up uneasy, then muttered, "It's just you're not used to this kind of crowd." I had been in rooms far more intimidating than that one. I had been face to face with bankers when our company was 2 weeks from bankruptcy, with lawyers trying to undermine contracts Richard and I had fought to secure. I had smiled through dinners with hostile competitors and charmed them into signing deals that kept the lights on. And yet, to my son and his wife, I was an old woman who folded laundry and served finger food. As I dried the last glass, I thought back to the man in the navy suit. "Are you the housekeeper?" he had asked. No, I wasn't. I was the foundation. Quiet, solid, unnoticed, until someone tried to kick it out from under the house. That night, lying in my small bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and thought of Richard's voice in those early years. Never let them see your whole hand until you're ready to play it. It was becoming clear to me I had been holding all the cards for years. I had simply forgotten that I could still deal with them. It was late autumn, the air sharp enough to sting when the front door opened. Laura had just returned from a day of shopping, her designer coat draped over one arm, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of money spent. I had been waiting for the right moment, and that evening seemed as good as any. In my hands, I held a small velvet box, the deep blue of it worn soft by decades of careful keeping. Inside was the diamond ring my mother had given me on my wedding day, a ring her own mother had worn before her. It was not enormous by today's standards, but its fire had not dimmed in 70 years. Every stone had been cleaned and reset by hand after my mother passed, and I had always intended for it to go to the next woman in the family, who would respect it. I waited until after dinner, when the plates were cleared, and John had gone to tuck our granddaughter into bed. Laura was scrolling through her phone, half listening to the soft jazz humming from the speakers. I sat down across from her and opened the box. "This ring," I began, my voice steady, was my mother's. She wore it through the Great Depression, through war, through raising 3 children with barely enough to eat. When she passed, she left it to me. And now I'd like to pass it to you, not just as jewelry, but as a reminder that strength and love can be carried in something you wear every day. Laura glanced inside, her eyes flitting over the diamond for barely a second before she closed the lid and pushed it back toward me. "This belongs in a pawn shop or a museum," she said flatly. "Not on my hand." The words hung there, cold and blunt, as if the weight of history meant nothing at all. I didn't argue. I simply closed the box and held it in my lap, letting the moment pass in silence. Later that week at dinner, I made the mistake of sharing a story from the past. John was away on business, and it was just Laura, our granddaughter, and me at the table. I began talking about the year the company nearly collapsed during the financial crisis. The late nights poring over contracts, the frantic phone calls to suppliers, the negotiations that kept us afloat. Laura set down her fork with a sigh. "Please, not your boring history lesson again," she said, looking at her phone. "We've all heard it 100 times." I stopped mid-sentence. Our granddaughter looked from me to her mother, unsure whether to speak. I excused myself quietly, leaving the rest of my food untouched. Upstairs, in the small room they called mine, I unlocked the safe at the back of my closet. Inside was more than just my jewelry and important documents. There was the real will my husband had signed before his death, the one no one here knew about. There was the original partnership agreement for the company we'd built, my name still printed clearly on the first page. And there was a letter written in Richard's hand, dated 2 weeks before he passed. A letter I had never shown a soul. I touched the envelope gently, running my thumb over his familiar script. His words had been my anchor for months, a reminder that I had not imagined my role in this family's history. I sat on the bed with the safe open beside me and let my fingers rest on the papers. I could still hear Laura's voice echoing from downstairs, that tone of dismissal, as if my entire life could be condensed into boring history. "I once saved this family's fortune," I whispered into the stillness of the room. "Now I'll save my dignity." The decision settled into me like a stone in deep water, silent, certain, irreversible. But before that morning came, just weeks before Richard's funeral, I had already begun laying the groundwork. What happened next had been set in motion long before the church filled with mourners. The morning after the funeral, I called a number I had not dialed in years. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Catherine," he said almost warmly, "I was wondering when you'd call." It was Thomas Avery, my late husband's personal attorney, a man who had drawn up not only Richard's business contracts, but also the prenuptial agreement we'd signed decades ago. He knew the family better than anyone, and more importantly, he knew the truth about the will. We met in his office the next afternoon, the blinds drawn, the faint scent of old leather and paper filling the air. He handed me a folder without preamble. Inside were copies of the will that no one else had ever seen, the one Richard had signed after his last hospital stay, leaving every asset, including the house and his shares in the company, entirely in my name. "The prenuptial agreement still stands," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. "Everything he built after your marriage is jointly yours, and his personal holdings default to you. They can challenge it, but they won't win." I ran my fingers along the pages, feeling their weight. "I want everything frozen until after the funeral. No sales, no transfers, no misplaced documents." Thomas nodded. "I'll file the orders today. They won't be able to touch a cent without your written approval." We shook hands, the kind of handshake that seals something unspoken. This was days before the funeral, while the house still buzzed with arrangements and whispered conversations about what would happen afterward. Back at the house, I moved quietly as if nothing had changed. I still made coffee in the morning, still set the table for dinner. But while Laura spent her afternoons in boutiques, and John locked himself in his study, I went through every shared file cabinet, every drawer. I removed anything with my name on it, bank statements, company contracts, deeds, stock certificates, and placed them in the small safe in my room. It took 3 days for them to notice. One evening, over roast chicken and red wine, John's tone turned suddenly sharp. "Mom, do you know where the company share certificates went? They're not in the safe downstairs." I dabbed the corner of my mouth with a napkin and looked at him steadily. "I keep important things close," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. Laura's fork clinked against her plate. John forced a smile, but I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. "Close? As in where?" he pressed. I took a sip of water. "Safe," I replied simply. "Just safe." No one spoke after that. The rest of the meal passed in an odd, brittle quiet. I could feel their thoughts spinning, the calculations forming behind their polite expressions. They did not yet know exactly what I had done, but they knew enough to be afraid. Later that night, I heard them in the hallway outside my door. Laura's whisper was urgent. "She's hiding something." "Why else would she take those papers?" John muttered. Something I could not catch, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. I closed my eyes and let the darkness settle around me. they still thought they had time, that their plans were only delayed. They had no idea that by the time they tried to act, the board would already be locked, every piece exactly where I wanted it. It started with a rumor I overheard in the kitchen. A phone call Laura was trying to keep quiet. She was pacing by the sink, her voice low but sharp. Yes, the timing is perfect. We sell the Maple Street property, wire the funds straight into Adam's startup account. He just needs the cash to get through the first round. Mom won't care. She doesn't even remember half of what's in her name. Adam, her younger brother, a man who had never worked a steady job, now suddenly the visionary founder of some app no one could explain without sounding drunk. I kept stirring my tea, my back to her, as if I were deaf, but my mind was already moving. That night, I retrieved the file from Maple Street. The deed was in my name, acquired through the prenuptial terms, though they had been operating as if it belonged to the family. Alongside it was a clause my late husband had insisted on years ago. In the event of any attempted sale without my written consent, I had the right to freeze the property indefinitely through a legal dispute claim. The next morning, I walked down to the little copy and fax store on Main Street. The clerk, a young man with hair like a haystack, helped me feed the papers into the machine. My fax went to 3 places: the holding bank, the county records office, and the real estate brokerage Laura had quietly contacted. The cover sheet was simple and direct. Property under legal dispute. All transactions without owner's consent are unlawful and subject to civil penalties. By lunch, the calls began. The brokerage wanted clarification. The bank wanted verification. The county clerk confirmed receipt and said the freeze was already filed in the system. At 3:12 p.m., my phone rang. An unfamiliar number, but the voice was instantly recognizable. Angry, nasal, and young. "You just killed our deal," Adam snapped. "Do you know how much you've cost me? This was going to change everything." I let a beat of silence stretch long enough to sting. "Everything?" I asked lightly. "Like the property that doesn't belong to you?" He swore something crude and lazy, then hung up. That evening, Laura stormed in, her face a theater mask of righteous fury. "Why would you do this? It was for family." I met her gaze evenly. So was keeping that property. We didn't speak again until the emergency family meeting. They called 2 days later. They gathered in the dining room, John, Laura, her brother Adam, and to my faint surprise, Thomas Avery, my lawyer. A few other relatives sat in the corners there, more for spectacle than support. Laura started, her voice trembling, but loud. "We have a serious problem. Maple Street can't be sold because someone," she all but spat the word, "filed a dispute. That someone is sitting right there." She jabbed a finger toward me. Thomas adjusted his glasses and turned a page in his folder. "Before we go any further, I think we should clarify a basic point. Who is the legal executor of the estate and the current legal owner of the contested properties?" The room went still. John glanced at Laura. Laura glanced at Adam. Adam stared at the table. "Well," Thomas pressed, his voice mild but relentless. Finally, John muttered, "She is." Thomas smiled faintly, closed his folder and leaned back. "Then the matter is settled. The freeze stands. Any attempted sale would be fraudulent. You'd be liable for damages." No one argued. The weight of the law hung in the air like smoke. I sat quietly through the rest of the meeting, listening to their halting excuses and half-formed complaints. But beneath their frustration, I could see it, that tiny dawning fear. It was not the noise of confrontation that broke them. It was the silence of a door closing. Quietly with a lock they could not pick. When I rose to leave, my chair scraped against the hardwood. I smoothed my skirt, offered a polite nod to the room, and walked out. My heels clicked down the hall, each step a reminder. They had thought I was powerless. Now they knew better. Later that same day, during the very funeral service I had been preparing for in silence, the minister closed his Bible and stepped aside. The funeral service for my husband, Richard Doyle, had been as solemn as a small-town Ohio church could make it. Had chosen not to speak during the service itself. I had said my goodbye to Richard in private, not in front of people who would rather see me gone. After the final hymn faded and people began to shift in their seats, the minister closed his Bible and stepped aside. That was when a tall man in a charcoal suit walked to the front. The moment he appeared, my son John's head snapped toward him. Laura's lips curved into the kind of smile you give when you are certain you're about to be proven right. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man began, his voice clear and carrying through the rafters, "my name is Thomas Avery. I am the attorney of the late Richard Doyle. According to Richard's written request, The will was to be read immediately after his funeral service, so there would be no room for rumors, disputes, or hidden dealings. A murmur rippled through the room. I caught the shift in posture from Laura, her shoulders pulled back, her chin tilted upward, already preparing to hear her name, followed by a long list of assets. I sat still, hands folded neatly over my gloves as if I were just another mourner, here to watch the formalities. Thomas opened a heavy leather folder, the kind that spoke of old money and older truths, and began to read. I, Richard Allen Doyle, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament. Laura's eyes glistened, not with grief, but with anticipation. To my beloved wife, Catherine Doyle. Thomas paused. And in that moment, I could feel Laura's pulse quicken from across the aisle. She was certain these were just polite opening words before her own windfall. I leave the sum of $9,800,000 in cash and liquid assets to be managed and used at her sole discretion. I also leave her my controlling shares in Doyle Industrial Holdings, my personal property, and the full rights to our primary residence. The sound that followed was not silence. It was shock compressed into a single moment. A chair creaked sharply somewhere behind me. Someone's breath caught audibly. Thomas continued, unshaken. To my son, John Doyle, and his wife Laura Doyle, I leave my heartfelt hope that they will one day understand that respect is the real inheritance. All other property and assets not herein specified remain under Catherine Doyle's control, to be allocated at her judgment. Laura blinked twice, her smile collapsing into a thin, pale line. John's face drained of color until he resembled the marble of the baptismal font. There were whispers now, sharp slicing ones. I heard all of it to her. And didn't they say she had nothing to do with the company? A cousin 2 pews back murmured, "Guess that's the end of the startup." Laura tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "This must be a mistake," she said loudly, her voice bouncing off the stone walls. Richard promised. Thomas didn't look at her. "This is the original will, notarized, signed, and dated 3 months before Mr. Doyle's passing. Any other document you may have seen was not legally recognized." My son shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Not with the entire room watching him. Not with the weight of his own lawyer's absence telling the truth for him. I rose, then slowly letting the wooden pew creak just enough to draw every eye. Richard always said, I began my voice, even that respect is the real inheritance. Sadly, some here have none to give. I let that hang in the air. No one moved. Even the minister kept his eyes on the floor. Laura opened her mouth to retort, but I lifted one hand just enough to stop her. This will was not written out of spite. I said it was written because my husband understood that a home is not built from wood and brick, but from loyalty, honor, and truth, and those things have been in short supply. The tension was thick enough to slow the air in my lungs. I could see the flush crawling up Laura's neck. John's jaw tightened until the vein at his temple pulsed. From the front row, my 10-year-old granddaughter shifted in her seat. Confused, she looked at her mother, then back at me, as if recalibrating every story she'd been told. I walked toward the lectern, each step measured, my heels clicking softly against the stone floor. Thomas stepped aside and placed the will on the edge of the podium. I didn't touch it. I will not embarrass anyone by recounting what has been said to me in this very family, I continued. But I will say this, what you inherit in money can be spent in a day. What you inherit in reputation takes a lifetime to lose. I saw the minister glance up at me, and for the first time all day, there was a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. Laura suddenly stood, the movement jerky. We took care of him. We were there. You just what? I asked quietly. Date in the background cooked the meals, kept the house running so you could play the devoted wife and son without lifting a finger for the business you claimed as yours. The room went still again. Even the air in the old church seemed to freeze. Thomas closed his folder. That concludes the reading, he said, but no one moved to leave. I turned back toward the pews. I will say one more thing, I told them. This house, this company, this fortune, Richard and I built it together. He knew the truth even when some of you chose to forget. And now, by his own hand, the truth stands. I stepped down from the lectern, the will still lying there like a final word. As I passed John, he muttered, You planned this. I stopped, leaned slightly toward him, and whispered, No, I protected what was mine. There's a difference. His mouth snapped shut. Outside, the January air was brittle and clean, a sharp contrast to the thick tension inside. Guests trickled out behind me, most avoiding eye contact. A few squeezed my hand or offered quiet words. Good for you. He would be proud. They never deserved it. I nodded politely, each phrase like a small stone added to a wall between me and the people who had tried to erase me. By the time I reached my car, I saw Laura still standing at the church steps, her arms crossed tight across her chest, her face pale with fury. John was beside her, speaking low, his eyes darting to where I stood. They didn't come over. They didn't have the courage. Thomas joined me at the car. You handled that with more restraint than most would, he said. I didn't need a scene, I replied. The truth did the work for me. He smiled faintly. Richard would have liked that. I looked back at the church one last time. They thought this was the day they'd win, I said softly. They never realized it was the day they'd lose everything. I sold off one of the commercial properties within weeks of the funeral, not because I needed the money. I had more than enough. But because I knew exactly where I wanted it to go, I set up the Richard A. Graham Scholarship Fund, dedicated to helping women who had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated by their own families. It was my quiet rebellion against the kind of cruelty I had endured, and my way of turning that pain into something that could not be taken away. When Laura finally reached out, her voice on the phone was careful, rehearsed. She wanted to meet to talk things over, to offer a public apology. I listened in silence until she was done. Then I said, apologies are words. I only accept actions, and it's too late for yours. I hung up before she could stammer a reply. 2 months later, I moved into a small, sunlit home on the edge of town. The walls were painted soft cream, the floors warm oak. There was no grand foyer, no marble counters, no heavy drapes, just a quiet space that felt like it belonged to me and no one else. I filled it with my books, a few framed photographs, and the sound of my own choosing. Jazz in the morning, silence in the afternoon, the wind through the back garden at night. For the first time in years, I woke up without someone's demands waiting on the other side of my bedroom door. I made coffee because I wanted it, not because anyone else did. I wrote letters. I sat in the sun with my hands wrapped around a mug and my mind free to wander. I never went back to the old house. I left it to them to figure out what a home feels like without the person who held it together. People sometimes ask me how it felt to win. I tell them the truth. It was never about winning. It was about reclaiming the space they tried to erase me from. It was about making sure that when the last word was spoken, it was mine. And so when I look back at that funeral, at Laura's smirk, at the way they thought they had cornered me, I can't help but smile. They thought they buried me that day. I tell myself, pouring tea in my little kitchen. They didn't know I was the one holding the shovel. Thank you for listening to my story. If it made you clench your fists, if it reminded you of moments when you were underestimated, dismissed, or told you were lucky to be given scraps, remember this. Luck had nothing to do with survival. We earn our place and we keep it even when others try to write us out. This was just one chapter from a lifetime of quiet battles. There are so many more women like me, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, who have endured in silence, but whose stories burn brighter than any insult ever thrown at them.